In November 1971, Israeli radar operators watch a single mark appear high above the Sinai. At first, it looks like a glitch. Too high, too fast, too clean. Two F-4 Phantoms are scrambled to intercept. They climb hard, afterburners lit, fuel pouring out, the sky turning darker by the second. For a moment, it feels like the kind of chase that ends with a silhouette in the gun sight. But it doesn't, because the target isn't running like a fighter. It's moving like a rule. The Phantoms never even get close. And that's the part that terrifies the room, not the fact that something got away, but the implication that, if this aircraft exists, then an entire layer of the sky no longer belongs to the West. For nearly a decade, the MiG-25 will be a ghost, seen in fragments, guessed at in briefings, argued over in Pentagon rooms, and exaggerated by fear. Until one day, in 1976, the mystery doesn't get solved by a spy, or a satellite, or a lucky photo. It gets solved by a mistake. A Soviet pilot drops the Foxbat onto a civilian runway in Japan, alive, intact, and waiting to be opened. And when the West finally looks inside, the truth is stranger than the myth. The Soviet Union had a problem no other country had at the same scale. It was simply too big to defend. An attack could come from the north, the west, the east, and when your territory is that vast, you don't get extra time. You get minutes. And in the early Cold War, the fear wasn't an enemy fighter. It was a bomber, a large aircraft carrying nuclear weapons, crossing the sky too fast to stop. The Soviet nightmare was simple. What if the Americans built a bomber that flew so high and so fast that nothing could reach it? Because if that happened, Soviet air defense would become a performance. The radars might see it. The bases might react. But the time between "it appeared" and "it's already gone" would be too short, and the logic became brutally simple. If the enemy flies high, you go higher. If it's fast, you become faster. If it arrives in minutes, you must already be in the air. That's how the Foxbat was born, not as a dogfighter, not as a maneuverable fighter, but as an interceptor machine. Climb as fast as possible. Reach the target as fast as possible. Fire, and that's it. The MiG-25 was never meant to be elegant. It was built for one purpose: catch the impossible aircraft before it becomes an explosion on the ground. And that leads to the core idea. If the enemy flies above everything, you build something that can reach him, no matter the cost. The Foxbat isn't a balanced design. It's an idea taken to the absolute limit. On paper, the mission sounded simple, almost elegant. In reality, it was insane. Climb high, go fast, see far, and bring down big targets before they crossed Soviet skies. So the engineers did what the Cold War rewarded most. They stopped chasing beauty and started chasing results. To climb fast, the MiG-25 needed raw power, real power, huge engines, built to push a heavy airframe into altitudes where the air starts to vanish. Giant air intakes, like open mouths, gulping everything they could to feed that hunger. A big, powerful radar, meant to see far, because in that mission, distance was the enemy. And massive missiles, because this wasn't a dogfight. It was an execution of large targets. The logic was industrial, almost cold. It didn't need to be elegant. It needed to work for the mission. But there's one thing nobody gets to negotiate. When you push a machine to the edge, physics collects. Mach 2 still feels like fast. Mach 3 doesn't feel like speed. It feels like temperature. The air turns into sandpaper. Friction turns into heat. And the metal starts living at the limit of what it can survive. At that pace, The Foxbat wasn't flying like a normal fighter. It was surviving. Any mistake in the math, any overpush, any extra second, could mean an engine giving out, a failure, or the airframe paying the price. And yet, it did it. And that's where its reputation is born. One no propaganda department even has to invent, when an aircraft can climb and run where almost nobody can reach. The rest of the world starts imagining what else it can do, even without knowing the truth. The Soviet Union didn't keep the MiG-25 hidden like a fragile secret. They treated it like a weapon and a performance. Because in the Cold War, you didn't always need to fire first. Sometimes you just needed the other side to believe you could. So they showed the Foxbat carefully. Not enough for anyone to measure it. Not enough for anyone to understand it. Just enough for the world to catch a glimpse and fill in the rest. A fast pass at an air show. A camera struggling to track it. A few seconds of footage that felt almost unreal. A silhouette tearing across the sky like a blade. And that was the point. Because uncertainty is more powerful than confirmation. What the West saw wasn't data. It was instinct. A jet with the outline of a fighter. Enormous air intakes that screamed big engines. A tall, brutal stance, more like a machine built to sprint straight upward than something meant to dance in the sky. Wings that, on grainy film, looked like they promised maneuverability, even if nobody could prove it. And the Foxbat didn't look advanced in a clean, futuristic way. It looked serious, like it was built for one job and nothing else. From the outside, it looked like the Soviets had built a machine that broke the rules. So the first question wasn't, what is it? The first question was, if they built this, what else did they build? That's how panic spreads in serious rooms. Not shouting, not alarms, just men in suits leaning closer to a table, a projector clicking to the next frame, a pencil circling an intake, a finger tapping a wing shape, again and again, as if repeating it would make it less threatening, because the fear didn't need to be real. It only needed to be plausible. And for a while, it was. The MiG-25 became the kind of threat that changes decisions on the other side of the planet. Budgets got fatter. Timelines got tighter. Requirements got harsher. And the paranoia got louder. Because nobody wanted to wake up one morning and realize they were 10 years behind. Not in jets, not in radar, not in missiles, not in the one thing that mattered most, the ability to control the sky. So the Foxbat didn't have to win battles yet. It only had to exist in people's minds as a shadow, a fast shadow, a high shadow, a silhouette that never stayed in frame long enough to be explained calmly. And then came the cruel part. The aircraft started showing up in the real world, on real missions, not in a perfect photo, not in a brochure, but as a dot on a radar scope. Climbing. Operators would watch it rise into the thin air, higher than the comfortable ceiling of fighters, faster than what the intercept math wanted to allow. A scramble order. Engines lighting, jets clawing for altitude, and still, nothing. No clean intercept, no dramatic dogfight, no missile shot that makes a headline, just the same ending, over and over. A radar trace, a fading dot, and then empty sky. The West didn't need to know the Foxbat's true limits to be forced to react. They only needed to believe the limits might be higher than their own. And that belief was enough to reshape the next decade. In the Middle East, where a single radar blip can become a crisis, the MiG-25 started doing something that felt wrong. It entered. It climbed. It crossed. And it vanished. It wasn't an engagement. It wasn't an exchange. It was a demonstration. First came the cold warning from the radar room, a contact too high, too fast, cutting across the scope like it had somewhere to be. Then came the reaction. Sirens, clipped orders, pilots sprinting, fighters launching and climbing on afterburner, trying to turn seconds into altitude. But the math didn't cooperate. Interceptors climbed, yes, but the Foxbat was already living in a layer of the sky where the word intercept started to sound. Hopeful. Because this isn't just about having a fighter. It's about reaching the target at the right time, at the right altitude, with enough energy left to do anything besides stare. And the MiG-25 seemed to have discovered the cheat code. It operated where everyone else could only visit for a few moments. The feeling it created was awful, and it wasn't the same as ordinary danger. It wasn't that you didn't have weapons. It was that you didn't have reach. You could have missiles. You could have pilots. You could have doctrine. You could have courage. But if the target is too high and too fast, all of that turns into frustration. That's how the aircraft became a metal ghost. Sometimes it didn't even need to be seen. The radar trace was enough. A clean line, a silent crossing, and then nothing. And the more it appeared, the more the legend grew. Because the human mind hates a gap. If you don't know what's inside that machine, you fill the void with imagination. And in the Cold War, imagination almost always meant the worst-case scenario. So the West started completing the puzzle on its own. If it flies like that, it must maneuver like this. If it climbs like that, it must be built from impossible materials. If it can reach there, then it can reach anywhere. It looked too advanced, too fast, and most of all, out of control. But there was an ironic secret hiding in this story. The MiG-25 really was terrifying, just not in the way everyone assumed. And that only became clear when something happened that nobody planned. Not a victory, not a kill, not a dogfight. A landing, September 1976. For years, the MiG-25 had been a rumor with an afterburner, something the West saw in fragments, a blur at an air show, a radar trace at impossible altitude, a silhouette that never stayed long enough to answer questions. And then, one day, it showed up over Japan. Not on a screen, not in a report, in the real sky. At first, it looks like the same story again. A fast contact, a high profile, an aircraft doing what it always did, appearing where it shouldn't be, and moving like it doesn't care who's watching. But this time, it doesn't disappear. It descends. It comes lower than it ever should. And then it does something that feels almost impossible. Not because of physics, but because of what it means. It lands. Not at a Soviet base. Not on a military runway waiting for it. Not on the kind of strip you build for a machine like this. It lands at an airport where it simply does not belong. The kind of event that looks like an accident. Until you realize it has the shape of a decision. Because the pilot wasn't confused. He wasn't lost. He wasn't making an emergency stop. He was escaping. His name was Viktor Belenko. And in a single act, he turned a decade of fear into a single, quiet opportunity. That's the pivot moment, when the West stops thinking like an audience and starts thinking like surgeons. Because this isn't just a defection. This is the mystery, parked on the ground, suddenly vulnerable. The Foxbat had spent years behaving like a ghost, too high, too fast, always gone. Now it was motionless, metal skin cooling in open air. A machine that had terrified intelligence rooms now sitting in a place where people could walk up to it, touch it, photograph it, measure it. And everyone understood the same thing at the same time. Moscow is going to want this erased. Not tomorrow, not next week, Now. So the race begins, but it's not the kind you see on television. No sirens, no headlines, no speeches, a silent race to secure the aircraft, to move it, to keep it out of sight, to get the right people in the same room, and to start looking inside before the story can be smothered. Because the goal wasn't to admire it. The goal was to open it, to unscrew the legend, to peel back the panels and finally answer the question that had been haunting Western planners for years. What is this thing really? And what they found was a shock. Not because it was more advanced than anyone imagined, but because it was different. Different in a way that exposed how fear works. Because sometimes the most dangerous part of an enemy weapon isn't what it can do. It's what you assume it can do, when you've never been close enough to check. And now, for the first time, they were close enough. They were about to learn what the Foxbat truly was, and what it had never been. When Western engineers and analysts finally began examining the MiG-25 up close, something unexpected happened. The fantasy started to crack. It wasn't an instant feeling of disappointment. It was stranger than that. It was confusion. Because this didn't look like the aircraft they'd imagined for years. The Foxbat wasn't a sleek fighter. It wasn't agile. It wasn't refined. It was brutal. A machine built like industrial hardware, large, heavy, thick-skinned. Nothing about it suggested air-to-air dancing. Everything about it suggested endurance. The MiG-25 had power, real power, but it paid for it everywhere else. The structure was heavy because it had to survive extreme heat. The wings were large, not to turn tightly, but to keep the aircraft flying at absurd altitudes. The engines were immensely strong, but practically disposable. Built to do the job, not to last. And that top speed, the one that terrified the world. It wasn't something you used casually. Pushing the Foxbat to the edge came with a physical price. Heat buildup, accelerated wear, permanent damage. It could reach Mach 3, but doing it meant hurting the aircraft. That changes everything. Because suddenly, the superfighter didn't feel like a free-roaming predator. It felt like a manned missile. The insane altitude made sense now. It wasn't showmanship. It was the plan. Climb fast, get above everything, detect the target, fire enormous missiles, and go home. No chase, no dogfight, no improvisation, a pure interceptor. And then came the most uncomfortable realization. The Foxbat had been designed for a very specific kind of air war. A kind of air war that was fading away. It was built to hunt big, fast, high-flying bombers. But as it entered service, the West was changing the question. Instead of, how do we fly higher? The new strategy became, how do we fly lower? Hug the terrain. Hide from radar. Use electronics, terrain masking, and stealth. Meaning, the MiG-25 wasn't a mistake. But it wasn't the future either. It was a perfect answer to a threat that was already evolving. And that didn't make it useless. It made it more interesting. The Foxbat was a monster perfectly built for its mission, and an even better symbol for the fear on the other side. Because for years, the West didn't fear what the MiG-25 truly was. They feared what they imagined it could be. And now, with the aircraft disassembled, measured, and understood, Moscow had a bigger problem than losing a technical secret. The West hadn't just seen the plane. The West had understood the logic behind it. They understood how Soviet air defense thought, how it prioritized, how it reacted to fear. And once you understand how the other side thinks, you start planning how to break that thinking. That was the real consequence of the defection. Not a lost aircraft, but an exposed doctrine. The defection wasn't just a diplomatic scandal. It was a strategic wound. Because military secrets don't exist only to hide numbers. They exist to hide logic. And the moment someone understands how a weapon works, they start seeing exactly where it hurts. Suddenly, the West wasn't looking at the MiG-25 as a terrifying shadow in the sky. They were looking at it as a system. They knew what the radar could see, and what it couldn't. They knew how far the engines could be pushed. And when they began to destroy themselves, they understood why the aircraft climbed so high, ran so fast, and why it couldn't do much beyond that. That changes everything. Because now, every Foxbat flight came with a quiet question on the other side. What if we do it differently? Fly lower. Confuse the radar. Force the interceptor out of its comfort zone. What used to be a card of intimidation now started to look like a marked card. For Moscow, that demanded an immediate response. Rushed upgrades, reworked systems, new variants, better sensors, more ability to engage targets across different altitudes, not because the MiG-25 had failed, but because it had been understood. And in the Cold War, being understood was almost as dangerous as being surpassed. Still, the Foxbat remained a milestone, because even with its limitations exposed, it proved something fundamental. The Soviet Union could build an extreme machine, not a prototype, not a promise. A real aircraft, mass-produced, capable of flying higher and faster than anything else in the sky. It was a message, loud and clear. We don't need to be elegant. We need to be dangerous. But the Cold War never stopped at the first draft, and there was an inevitable next step. Because if the MiG-25 was brute force, its successor would have to be brute force with intelligence. More sensors, more coordination, more awareness of the battlefield. And that next machine wouldn't be built just to scare people. It would be built to control the sky. In the end, the Foxbat wasn't the aircraft that won the sky. It was the aircraft that won the enemy's mind. For years. Because it didn't need to shoot anyone down to do damage. It only needed to appear too high, too fast, and then disappear before anyone could turn it into something manageable. That's the part people miss about the Cold War. It wasn't only missiles and speeches. It was a contest of confidence. And the MiG-25 attacked confidence perfectly. It turned radar returns into rumors. It turned grainy footage into headlines. It turned uncertainty into planning panic. And once that doubt gets planted, it spreads in the places that quietly decide the future. Intelligence briefings, procurement committees, design studios, war colleges. Because a military doesn't fear what it understands. It fears what it can't measure. For nearly a decade, the Foxbat lived in that gap. A silhouette that changed meetings, budgets, requirements on the other side of the planet. It forced the West into the most dangerous question in military planning. What if we're behind? Not just behind in speed, behind in radar, behind in missiles, behind in sensors, behind in engineering, behind in the ability to own the sky when it matters most. And the MiG-25 made that fear feel plausible, because it kept showing up in the real world, where excuses don't survive. Then the impossible happened. The mystery landed in the wrong place, and suddenly the legend became a machine sitting still on concrete. Quiet, vulnerable, measurable. Fear became a checklist. Rumor became numbers. Myth became metal. And the world learned the truth. The MiG-25 wasn't perfect. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't a dogfighting superfighter. It was extreme. A jet built like a hammer. Built to climb fast, run hard, see far, launch big missiles, and come home. A solution aimed at one terrifying problem, pushed to the edge of physics to make it work. And that's why this story is so addictive. Because it isn't really about an airplane. It's about how a machine becomes a message, how speed becomes propaganda, how altitude becomes intimidation, how a single silhouette can force an enemy to spend money, change doctrine, and redesign the future, without ever firing a shot. The Foxbat began as a response to Soviet fear, and ended up becoming fear on the other side. And if you think this was just a scare, just a 1970s legend, watch what happens next. Because the Soviet Union didn't accept being understood. It tried to erase the compromises. It tried to keep the altitude and speed, but add the missing pieces: awareness, coordination, endurance. It tried to build a successor that wasn't just fast, but smart. So the next chapter isn't about going higher. It's about staying dangerous in a sky that's changing. An aircraft designed not only to reach the edge, but to hunt there, with a system behind it, and a plan that doesn't rely on mystery. Because the real secret of the Foxbat was never the Mach number. It was what that Mach number made the world believe.